We had such an interesting session focusing on diet and atopic dermatitis, and this is an area that's really of interest to both clinicians and patients. A lot of my patients come in pretty much convinced that food is the main driver of their atopic dermatitis or of their kids' atopic dermatitis, and it's really an interesting discussion. The first point, I think, is that there is an important increased risk of true food allergy in patients with atopic dermatitis, and it actually seems to get worse with increasing severity of the disease. So if you have more severe atopic derm, you're much more likely to have true food allergies. And by that I mean, if you eat a peanut, your lips blow up, you might vomit, you might have angioedema and anaphylaxis, you could even die. So that's the food allergy we're really talking about. So that is real. But many patients think that that's what also is driving their eczema, and that's the part we don't really seem to think bears out when you put people in trials. My favorite study was from Dr. John Hannafin a number of years ago, where they took a group of patients who were convinced that food was the main driver or the only driver of their atopic dermatitis. They hospitalized them, put them on a strict protocol, and gave them a double-blinded food controlled challenge, where they give them the food and they have a placebo food, and they saw. And in that group, by the end of the hospitalization, where they also did really good skincare and helped them get better, 80% felt that food was not the driving factor. So it really seems that for the vast majority of people, food is probably not the main driver. I always like to temper it a little bit by saying that a healthy diet is really good for everybody. I want you to be in optimal fitness and shape and taking good foods and minimizing processed foods. And I also think there probably are some foods that are inflammatory. So things, for example, like dairy products, unfortunately, which many of us love, they seem to have an inflammatory effect. It's not an allergic effect, but just a pro-inflammatory effect in the body. And we see this in other diseases, for example, in acne, that the relationship is even stronger. So it is certainly possible that certain foods just kind of contribute to inflammation. But again, that's different than being a primary driver of the disease. The most important part being that when you remove those foods, you don't expect it to be clear, right? It wouldn't be clear. You might be a little bit better, but not clear. And that's the difference, and we're really trying to drive home. What's really fascinating to me now is that everything's been turned on its head, and really just the past 4 or 5 years. If you look at guidelines from just a couple of years ago, the recommendation was to give kids peanuts later on. Wait on giving highly allergenic foods. The idea was that, boy, these things can cause an allergy, so let's wait until they're a little bit older, till the immune system is more developed, perhaps. The rationale was never clear, but it turned out that it was totally backfiring. Meanwhile, the incidence of peanut allergy was going up and up and up. And some very sharp people looked and said, boy, in Israel, this is not happening. The peanut allergy risk is really low, and they put some ideas together, and it turns out that one of the common feeding foods for babies, like a finger food and a teething food, is a peanut puff. And they actually taste great. They kind of taste like a little peanutty thing. They're made with real peanuts, and they then seem to tolerize for peanut and do not develop peanut allergy. Why does this matter for dermatologists? Why do we care? Well, it turns out that the way we think this is all happening, and the reason why food allergy is higher in kids with more severe atopic dermatitis, is that the way it happens is through the skin, so-called transcutaneous sensitization. The peanut allergies, and presumably other allergens from environmental things or things in the world in general, then can enter into the skin abnormally because the skin barrier is damaged or leaky, what we like to call as leaky skin, and then the body makes an immune response to it. You can circumvent this by giving it to the gut first. So if you feed people early enough, then you actually will tolerize to it and avoid that whole process. Or presumably, if you protect the skin barrier, if you can heal the eczema, lock the skin down, then you won't get that abnormal process. Some of this is still speculative, but this is really where the research is going, and we're all excited to see what's going to happen in the next couple of years as some of the bigger studies bear fruit, and we're going to learn more about them. Many patients are interested in the concept of leaky gut, where the gut barrier is also damaged and allowing proteins and other irritants and pathogens to get into the bloodstream when they shouldn't. And I actually think there's something to this. If we think about the epithelium of our skin, it just curves around our lips and becomes the epithelium of our gut. It's very similar. It stands to reason that if we have leaky skin, we probably have leaky gut. And that actually has been borne out with a couple of interesting studies where they measure this ratio of absorption of sugars, a large sugar and a small sugar. And they're actually able to show that people that have a leaky gut, that large sugar, which shouldn't be in the blood at all, it should come out through the stool, the blood levels spike. They actually measure it in the urine. What's remarkable here is that when they gave a probiotic, a lactobacillus probiotic to these patients, that leakiness improved, which is really compelling. Now, when we look larger at the epidemiologic data, when you give patients with existing atopic dermatitis probiotics, it's actually much more complicated. Some studies show a small effect, others show no effect. I would say arguably right now, most people kind of say it's probably not helpful, probably not enough evidence to recommend it. I would challenge that a little bit. I think if you look at the individual studies, some individuals seem to have a bigger response. So here's my question. Is it possible that there are individuals who respond beautifully to it, but it's only a subtype or a subgroup? So if you give it to a number of people, you lose that effect, it becomes washed out. And is it possible that in a few years, when we are better able to identify these subtypes, hopefully just through observation, instead of having to do genetics or blood serologies, we can actually just look at a phenotype and say, I think you're going to respond, or maybe a swab, microbiome swab, and say, you're going to do great with this particular probiotic at this dose. Maybe we'll be able to show a robust effect. And that's why I don't want to lose hope on that, and also why I tend to recommend it for my patients, because it's fairly safe, they're fairly inexpensive, and if you happen to be the lucky one who responds, we just did a great thing. If it doesn't seem to be helping after a few months, we can simply stop it. Many patients will say that they want to try to avoid a certain food and see if it helps. And historically, this has been a very reasonable approach, and for adults in particular, I'll say, okay, go ahead, do it for a month or two, let's be very honest, and then when you reintroduce it, we'll see what happens. That's often a good proving, if you will. If you take the food back and your eczema goes crazy, then I think that's more compelling. But that being said, a recent paper came out that suggested patients who exclude a food completely from the diet are much more likely, on the order of 20% of these patients, when they reintroduce it, to develop a true food allergy, IgE mediated. And some of those are even going to have anaphylaxis. So now I think it's important that we counsel our patients. It's actually not entirely benign to just randomly skip a food because you suspect that it may be causing it. And I think we need to focus more than ever on healing the skin barrier, getting the eczema under control, and hopefully minimizing the impact to diet beyond, of course, encouraging a healthy diet that's going to give them the nourishment and non-processed junk that's going to take away from their overall health that they need.